It is now my very great pleasure to introduce our Minister of Defence and Minister of Veterans Affairs, Honourable Ron Mark, a man who had a great career both within the New Zealand Forces and in the Omani Forces. Ron has a great service to the community in a number of organisations, particularly service to Māori. Ron, Minister, we look forward to working with you, and we look forward to hearing your speech. Thank you.
E nā mana, e nā rio, e nā rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Haere mai ki te hui hui nei, haere mai ki te hui e tau o the Royal New Zealand Returned and Services Association. I want to start by acknowledging, firstly, by publicly thanking the Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister of New Zealand, and congratulating her, but thanking her for the confidence that she has expressed in making this appointment, appointing me as Minister of Defence and Minister for Veterans. And because I'm not quite sure if she realises how personal this is and what an absolute honour and a privilege I find it to be. I want to acknowledge National President B.J. Clark, who was my senior when I marched into Waihuru in 1971. BJ. CEO Jack Steer, and all of the assembled Chiefs of Staff, the Diplomatic Corps, and I won't start naming because I'll miss someone, but I do want to particularly acknowledge the Secretary of Defence who is sitting there in the second row as well. I've actually got a prepared speech, and right now I'm not too sure if I want to deliver that or just keep this personal. Flexibility is always one of those principles that I've always taken great advantage of in my time in the military. But I think it's, and so I'm going to do that right now, and if I get back to the speech, that might be a good thing. I want to acknowledge a couple of things. I've sat here looking through the audience and through the attendees and the faces, and I see amongst you a particular individual who was the person who I served under as a corporal in 2nd 1st Battalion, who was the man who recommended me for commissioning, who was later the Director of Infantry and SAS when I completed SAS selection in Papakura. Sir. I see someone else who was my senior at Officer Cadet Training Company, passed out the year before me, and who's gone on to lead a very distinguished military career, and I think we caught up in Fiji, no, where was it? Somewhere in the Pacific Islands. I still have your compass, and I still have the t-shirt, the polo shirt, from Tampistan. And I see other people sitting up in the back seats there, one who was my principal workshop foreman, 2 field workshops, and a number of other people who throughout the course of my 15 years in the New Zealand Army mentored me, guided me, taught me, men and women. What I also note are the empty seats. And to me, those seats represent people who were responsible for mentoring me, training me, disciplining me, and teaching me what it was to be a member of the New Zealand Defence Force. I still remember standing in a queue as a 16-year-old soldier, holding my KFS in my left hand, waiting to get into the mess for breakfast, with NCOs walking up and down the line, checking our shoes, checking our uniforms, checking our cutlery. And the one thing that struck me is that all of the NCOs were behind me, all of them. Those that stood behind me in that queue were firstly Lance Corporals, then there were Corporals, then there were Sergeants, then there were Staff Sergeants, then the CSMs, then the Cadet RSM. Beyond that, the NCOs of the Regular Force Cadre of the Regular Force Cadet School. I mean, in between running from that queue and going around the gum tree and coming back for having made small misdemeanors while standing in the queue, I learnt something. And I learnt that the New Zealand Army was renowned for always putting its men and its women in its ranks first. It was a lesson that I tried to teach to my RSM in my unit in Oman in the Sultan Special Force. I commanded the EMI element over there. When we had a dinner in the workshop where I hosted all of the officers from the other squadrons and the warrant officers, and I wondered why the troops weren't eating. And my warrant officer came over to me and said, "Sir, as a good Indian RSM would, sir, you must eat." I said, "Sorry, Mr. Pillai, put the troops through, we'll eat after." And still they sat, and he came back again. He said, "Sir, you must eat." I said, "Mr. Pillai, put the troops through." He said, "Sir, they cannot eat until you have eaten." I learned then from a very brief discussion with my WO1 that in the Indian Army, the officers went through first. So in our conversation, where I learned that he could be quite a stubborn chap, we came to an agreement where he would serve up a meal for me and put it on the table. And if by the time the last soldier had gone through there was no food, they were to take that plate. And the same for two of the other former New Zealand Army officers who were standing left and right of me. It was curious to me, strange to me, that the other people that I was serving alongside of, who were Brits, Australian, Indian, didn't think like we think, didn't behave like we behave, didn't lead the way we led. And it brought me right back to my roots and where I was trained, New Zealand. I just want to say to you here today that I do find it an absolute privilege, an honour, but more to the point, a huge responsibility to be given the appointments that I have been given. And I promise you that I will discharge those duties faithfully and loyally, and that I will always have at the forefront of my mind the well-being, the welfare of the men and women of our Defence Forces and those who have served and who are now in retirement or pursuing other careers. A speech that was written was quite a long one, and I'm actually not going to go through it, so it will be available. But the points that I want to emphasise are these. In the very short week that I've been in the job, I've had the opportunity to speak to Chiefs of Defence Force and Chief of Defence Force and Chiefs of Staff. I've sat in on many briefings. I've had the opportunity to visit Exercise Katapo in the South Island. It gave me the opportunity to see their Army, Navy and Air Force all performing their duties all within one day. From what I've seen and the opportunities that I've taken over my parliamentary career to get into the Solomons, East Timor, Afghanistan, I'm hanging out to get into Iraq as fast as we can. I have always been impressed by the level of professionalism and dedication of our service personnel. Nothing has changed. From the very first time that I deployed as a young officer or as a corporal to the time that I came home in 1990 after spending 5 years in the Sultanate of Oman, working alongside of other Kiwis, Rhodesians, Australians and Brits, and to what I see today, what I saw on Sunday, nothing has changed. We all have every reason to be thoroughly, absolutely proud of our men and women in our Defence Force. The challenge for me will be ensuring that they have that which is required to go about performing the duties that we impose upon them professionally. The challenge we will have is making sure that we care for their families whilst they're deployed. The challenge we will have is ensuring that those first responders who are responding to their needs after they have left the service and having returned from active service are likewise equipped and tooled to do the job that they need to do to look after our people. Much has been said today about the issues confronting us over PTSD. And I want to thank those people, first responders, no duff, for the work they do, you, the members of the RSA, for the work you do, the Fallen Heroes Trust, and a young man by the name of Dion Jensen, who has written a book, PTSD, The Good News. Dion Jensen is not a man who has suddenly set out to write a book and make himself famous. He is a man who's gone through those issues himself. Every one of us who has served knows someone who post-deployment left us. I can name a number. In my time as a Member of Parliament, I have met many young men. Fortunately, at this point, not one young woman. But that doesn't mean that they are not out there. They are. But young men and women who need help and need our support. The fact that in the United States, the last figure I saw, they were losing 22 servicemen a day. 22 a day. That's a higher casualty rate that they had under deployment in Afghanistan and Iraq put together. In the foreword that I wrote for Dion Jensen's book, I said, if we had 22 elderly people beaten to death in their homes a day, if we had 22 children beaten to death a day, if we had 22 banks robbed a day, politicians would be screaming from the rafters. People would be demanding action. Newspapers and writers would be all over every one of us, and rightly so. But it doesn't seem that we have the same level of concern at this point in time for those people who are suffering. And as BJ has said, many of these people who have returned from active service, operational service, probably don't right now believe that they do need help. Probably right now don't have the skills or the tools to identify the fact that they are in trouble. Some of them are probably still serving and might be viewed right now for being rather troublesome people, a bit out of control, people who need to get their lives together, people who have resorted to drug use, alcohol abuse, whose marriages are on the rocks, whose performance in the job has deteriorated. And some of them might well be getting written off as just people who are dysfunctional and need to be gotten rid of. We need to do better. We need to use those tools that are available to help them to do the one thing that they will be most reluctant to do, and that is admit that they need help and put their hand up and ask for it. What we need to ensure is that the people who are connecting these service people of ours, the professionals, are able to communicate them in the language that they understand, are able to give them that space where they will do the one thing that is totally against everything in their body, and that is admit that they need help. We put a lot of store in this country, don't we? On bravery, on self-reliance, being able to look after ourselves. We look down on people who can't do that. And as service personnel, that is the last person we want to be thought to be. As a service person, we take great pride in the fact that we don't need help. We're okay. We can sort it out. We're tough. We're self-reliant. The last thing on our mind, the last thing we want to have to admit, is that we're not okay, and we do need help. Those people need a mechanism. They need the mechanism that helps them to evaluate themselves and come to that decision themselves and put that hand up. At that point, NODUF and the other personnel that are available to the chiefs of staff can then swing into action. At that point, then the RSA can swing into action. Ladies and gentlemen, it's since I've taken up this appointment, I've had a couple of occasions to, yesterday I attended the Beersheba commemorations. I know that there are commemorations still to go on throughout this year. And through all of those commemorations, and particularly as we move towards the commemoration of Armistice Day, each time we will reflect on our forebears, each time we will reflect on our forefathers, our family members who deployed and who paid the ultimate price. Last week it was Al Alamein, and I was thinking of one of my foster uncles whose grave I visited at Al Alamein. Every one of us in this room, including, as we have just heard, the Prime Minister, has a connection with those years. Battles today, operations today are quite different to what they were. Thank God we no longer deploy men and women by the tens of thousands who have been conscripted to go to far-flung nations to do the job we ask. But the stresses, the strains, the responsibilities are just as great, and dare I say it, for the private soldier with the rifle on the ground at that moment, at that time. Given the rules of engagement, given the political focus, given the focus of media, both national and international, and some of it we've seen recently, I don't recall any conflict that we have ever deployed to as a nation where the actions taken by a lance corporal on the ground, actions taken in a nanosecond based on what that individual is confronted with and sees and is struggling and is coming to terms with, could be pulled apart and dissected over the next 2 months, 2 years, 10 years, where other people who have never worn a uniform, never deployed operationally, make judgment upon that individual's decision at that point in time. I want to thank you very much for asking me to speak, for the privilege of being here. As a returned serviceman, I hold the RSA and a member of the RSA since 1983. I hold the RSA in the highest esteem. And BJ, I had a whisper in the Prime Minister's ear whilst you were delivering your message. I did tell her that, I did ask her if she remembered that in 2005, 2007. There was a conversation between a couple of people and the Right Honourable Winston Peters in a Corey lounge. And as a result of that conversation between those members, those executive members of the RSA, the government of the day, which was the New Zealand First Labor government, appropriated a set amount of money to the RSA. I understand now from my briefings that that appropriation was terminated. I did remind the Prime Minister of that, and I'm pretty confident that there will be discussions a little bit later on, which you might like the outcome of. Thank you very much.